Nintendo wasn't what it used to be. That sentence shows up every time Nintendo does anything, whether it's a price increase, a remake announcement, a sequel that doesn't look exactly like the one you played when you were 12. Just see people say how Nintendo fell off or lost its soul, or that Nintendo used to care. And right now, the argument feels louder than it has in a long time. The Switch 2 got announced last year, and prices went up. Remakes and remasters have been happening, and Nintendo has been making decisions that have made a lot of waves. But beyond that, Nintendo feels a lot more corporate than they used to be. They don't have the same faces that they did a decade ago. Does that just mean that Nintendo of today is a completely different company that quote-unquote fell off? Well, I'm going to talk about that, because the moment you actually slow down and listen to these complaints, you'll see that for the past couple decades, people have been saying the same thing, that Nintendo was better back then. And what is back then? For some people, it's early in the Switch's life cycle. For some people, it's the Wii U. For people like me, it's the Wii and the DS. And for some people, it's all the way back to the NES and Game Boy. So when someone says Nintendo was better back then, what are they actually talking about? Is it the games, the prices, the hardware, the company's personality, the way Nintendo Directs used to feel when they were hosted by people you knew? Or is it something less tangible, like the feeling of being a Nintendo fan at a very specific moment in your life, before you grew up, before you had responsibilities? And is the Nintendo of today actually worse than it was at those times? Here's the uncomfortable truth that sits underneath almost every Nintendo argument. Before I continue, I just want to say, subscribe if the era when you grew up in was the best Nintendo era. When people talk about Nintendo being better, they're usually talking about the era when Nintendo meant the most to them. Not when the company was objectively at its best, not when it was the most consumer friendly, not when it made the fewest mistakes, just when it lined up perfectly with their age, their free time, and their expectations. That's why these conversations never really go anywhere, and then someone else will fire back with sales numbers or Metacritic scores or a list of modern classics, and neither side convinces the other, because they aren't actually debating facts, they're defending their own memories. The Wii era feels magical to people who grew up during that time, because they were young and have all the memories of playing Wii Sports with friends. The GameCube era will feel magical to people who are a little older, and even the early Switch era will feel like this to people now, since it's been 9 years at this point. And once you recognize that, the idea that Nintendo changed starts to get a lot more complicated, because Nintendo has always been a company full of contradictions and controversy. The version of Nintendo people fall in love with is usually the version that means the most to them. And that's why the Switch 2 discourse feels so emotionally charged. It isn't just about prices or ports, even though that is a big part of it. It's about it being what's currently on the market. Think about all your memories with the Wii and the DS. You probably thought of only positive things. It doesn't mean that it was perfect. It was far from perfect. I mean, look at this. Over time, we tend to just look at the positives of something that's meant to be fun, which is Nintendo. Since the Switch 2 is the current generation, we're going to take it into account the good and the bad, and especially with social media that focuses a lot more on negativity, you're going to be seeing a lot more of that. If you rewind far enough, the idea that Nintendo lost its way shows up way earlier than most people remember. It didn't start with the Switch, it didn't start with the Wii U, it didn't even start with the Wii. People were saying this exact same thing in the 1990s. The difference is that there was no social media back then. People just seemed happier, and most you would see message boards with people complaining, but those weren't as mainstream. Take the jump from the Super Nintendo to the N64. Today, the Nintendo 64 is remembered as this legendary machine packed with genre-defining classics: Super Mario 64, Ocarina of Time, Star Fox 64, and it did earn that reputation, eventually. But for people who lived during that era, there was a different story. Nintendo stuck with cartridges, while Sony made a new console with discs called the PlayStation. Games cost more, storage was limited, third-party support evaporated almost overnight, entire genres felt like they vanished. RPG fans in particular felt completely abandoned, with Final Fantasy VII going to PlayStation. And on top of that, the release schedule was painfully slow. Some years it felt like Nintendo released 2 big games and then disappeared, and people weren't saying Nintendo was perfect back then, but they were criticizing those decisions 30 years ago. And the thing is, those complaints weren't wrong. Nintendo was stubborn, it was out of sync with parts of the industry, they did make decisions that hurt their own momentum, but those frustrations didn't survive in the cultural memory the same way the games did. Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time are what you think of when you think of the Nintendo 64, not all the controversies and problems with it. The long waits, missing genres, the lack of third-party support, Superman 64. All kind of just faded away. It's not because they didn't matter, but it's because over time people stopped looking at that. And this is the pattern that keeps repeating. Nintendo releases something great and eventually overwhelms the complaints that surround it. But while you're living through the error, all you can see are the delays, the decisions that don't make sense yet, the flops. And when you're in the middle of that frustration, it's easy to assume that this is when Nintendo finally lost it. Well, that is until enough time passes and suddenly this era becomes someone else's back then. The funny thing about Nintendo criticism is that it never actually goes away, it's just gonna change. During the Nintendo 64 era, the complaint was stubbornness. Nintendo was too rigid, too controlling, too obsessed with doing things its own way when the industry was clearly moving in a different direction. By the time the GameCube arrived, that complaint shifted slightly. Nintendo moved on to disc, but not the traditional ones. The lunchbox design got mocked endlessly. The lack of a DVD player was another issue at the time. And once again, third-party support lagged behind competitors in ways that felt impossible to ignore. Even Nintendo's own games weren't immune to scrutiny. Wind Waker's art style backlash was intense at launch, with fans insisting Nintendo had made Zelda too childish and yearned for the Nintendo 64 titles. Mario Sunshine was criticized for feeling rushed and clunky. Metroid Prime, which is now considered one of Nintendo's biggest successes, was accused of not being a real Metroid before it even released. The same games that are now defended so passionately were once misunderstood classics. This is important because it shows that nostalgia doesn't just smooth over bad business decisions, but it'll change how people look at certain games. I mean, how many people at that time realized they were playing one of the greatest games of all time in Dance Dance Revolution Mario Mix? Then the Wii arrived, and instead of ending the complaints, it just changed them. Nintendo stopped being accused of being out of touch and started being accused of selling out. Motion controls were seen as gimmicks. Wii Sports was dismissed as a glorified tech demo from a lot of people. Core Nintendo fans felt ignored as Nintendo chased a massive casual audience that frankly didn't care about Nintendo discourse at all. Even as the Wii sold astronomically well, there was a lot of worrying among Nintendo fans that Nintendo was abandoning depth in favor of mass appeal. Looking back, all of these criticisms do have some truth to them. Nintendo really did struggle to balance its audience. It really did make hardware decisions that confused people. They really did release games that felt unfinished or not great at the time, alongside genuine masterpieces. The idea that Nintendo used to be consistently flawless just doesn't survive when you actually look back at these eras of Nintendo. What does survive is the memory of how the best games made people feel, not the arguments that surrounded them. One of the biggest tricks nostalgia plays is convincing people that great Nintendo games used to come out constantly, like every year was stacked and every release was a hit. But when you actually look at release calendars instead of box art, that illusion collapses pretty quickly. Nintendo has always operated in bursts, huge releases followed by long stretches of quiet, incredible games that had to carry entire years on their backs because there was nothing else around them. The Nintendo 64 is maybe the most extreme example of this. It's remembered as one of the most influential consoles ever made, and it absolutely earned that reputation over time, but for people who lived through it, it meant accepting that Nintendo might release 3 major games in a year and just call it. And that's been a theme for every single Nintendo console. Look at 2007 for the Wii. We got Super Mario Galaxy, Super Paper Mario, Metroid Prime 3, Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn, Mario Party DS, Mario Strikers Charge, Mario Party 8, which is a personal favorite of mine, among other games. But then if we just go a few years in the future towards the end of the Wii era, you can see some of these years weren't as great. This is why modern droughts feel worse, even when they aren't actually longer. Because are you really going to remember the long droughts or weaker years from 15 to 20 years ago? Or are you just going to remember the games that actually came out? We all think of 2018 as a huge year for the Nintendo Switch, but when you actually look at what came out, there wasn't too much besides Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. Yes, 2025 wasn't the greatest year for Nintendo if we look at it objectively, but was it really an all-time bad year? Or are people just looking at it through recency bias? Another thing nostalgia quietly deletes is how often Nintendo has been in the middle of some kind of controversy. Not the internet ending kind, but the slow frustrations that make fans wonder if Nintendo is actually listening to them at all. This did not start with the higher prices of the Switch 2, or the poor online infrastructure of previous consoles. Nintendo has always had a habit of doing things that just don't seem to make sense. In the early days, it was control. Nintendo's strict licensing practices during the NES era were controversial even then. Developers had limits on how many games they could release. Cartridges had to be manufactured through Nintendo. If Nintendo didn't like what you were doing, you were out. This was framed as protecting quality, and in some ways it did work, but it also pushed developers away and created resentment that would come back later. Nintendo was not universally loved for being consumer friendly, but they were the biggest player in the industry. That tension really blew up during the Nintendo 64 era. Like I mentioned with choosing cartridges, this destroyed Nintendo's third-party support. Then a similar thing happened in the GameCube, and with the Wii, it was far less powerful than the Xbox 360 and PS3. In fact, the Wii was the only console this generation to not play in HD. It used friend codes and lacked a lot of online features that its competitors had. By the time the Wii U arrived, all of these unresolved frustrations collided at once. Confusing branding made people unsure whether it was even a new console. The release schedule was slow and uneven. Some of Nintendo's best games arrived years too late to matter at the time, and people generally thought this was the end, that Nintendo would finally burn through all its goodwill and that they were going to stop making consoles. And this does matter from a historical standpoint, because it changes how we look at the Switch era and now the Switch 2. Because unlike with the Switch 2, when Nintendo entered the generation in a good spot, the Switch launch was seen as do or die. Nintendo was at one of its lowest points and needed the Switch to be successful. Nintendo may not have that scrappier feel that they did during the times when they weren't as successful compared to being an even bigger powerhouse now, and that definitely can affect how people view the company. One of the most persistent accusations thrown at modern Nintendo is that it's relying too heavily on the past. Too many remakes, too many remasters, too many familiar names recycled instead of being pushed forward. And on the surface, that complaint makes complete sense. When you look at the Switch release calendar and see Mario Kart 8 still being sold years later, Zelda remasters filling gaps between mainline entries, and entire generations of games resurfacing again, feels like Nintendo is stuck looking back instead of moving on. But here's the part that complicates the narrative. Nintendo has always reused its past. During the NES and SNES days, games didn't disappear when new hardware arrived. They were re-released constantly through budget lines, revisions, and best of collections. On the Game Boy, Nintendo was still selling black and white versions of some NES games. The Game Boy Advance, of course, had a lot of SNES ports. 3DS and Wii U had plenty of remasters and remakes. So while Nintendo is objectively making more remakes and remasters nowadays, it's not like they're new to this. Especially if you go back to the 3DS era, you'll see people complain about remakes or remasters that didn't need to happen. So while I do agree that there are issues with Nintendo just porting all these old games and selling them at full price, it's not like this is a brand new issue like people act like it is. So this is where the Switch 2 conversation really locks into place. The frustration surrounding it isn't just about one console or one price point or one port, it's about what the Switch 2 represents. For the first time in a long time, Nintendo is launching a system that doesn't feel like it's fixing a crisis. All it's doing is just refining a successful console, and refining a console is always less exciting than saving the entire brand and doing something completely innovative. The original Switch was revolutionary because it solved a problem Nintendo created for itself. It unified handheld and home gaming, it made Nintendo's output feel focused again. Expectations were low, so every win felt enormous, but the Switch 2 doesn't get that grace period that the Switch had. It isn't arriving as a comeback story, it's just a sequel to what may be the most popular console of all time when it's all said and done. It has the same ecosystem, the same franchises, basically the same audience, so all of that is going to make people be more critical. I myself have said that the Switch 2 launch feels nothing like the original Switch launch where there was CND, camping outside the Nintendo store, and all the hype on YouTube. And on one hand, that may be true. Maybe the Switch 2's hype was really that much less than the original Switch, or maybe I just remember it more fondly being 14 years old when the Switch came out. Perhaps the biggest controversy with the Switch 2 being the prices is really what has made people look back in the past when games were cheaper. $450 for the Switch 2, which is the most expensive Nintendo console, $80 for Mario Kart World on its own, $80 for Switch 2 versions of $60 games on the Switch, $70 standard releases for Switch 2 games, and these have made people look back on $50 and $60 games a lot more fondly. I've said many times, $80 games are a huge issue. You can't tell me there's any universe where Mario Party Jamboree Switch 2 edition should cost $20 more than the original that came out a couple years ago. That is an issue people have been calling out, and we should continue calling out, but acting like Nintendo never had any issues with prices in the past just isn't true. Look at the 3DS when that launched. Nintendo within months lowered the price. Now, I do think the issue is bigger now, but I don't think we should just ignore the past and say Nintendo was perfect back then. And maybe the one thing that makes people say Nintendo was better in the past more than prices is, of course, the games. Go to any ranking of any Nintendo series, and you'll see someone who's 40 years old saying how all the old games were so much better than what we have today. And is that true? Maybe, maybe not. There's no objective measure for what game is the best and what game is the worst. But you're a lot more likely to have your favorite games of all time be games you played as a kid because you had less to compare it to, you only remember the fond memories, and you're just nostalgic for it. While not every Nintendo game now is a hit, they've still made incredible games in the past generation. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are all-time classics by a lot of people. Super Mario Odyssey, Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, Donkey Kong Bonanza, Metroid Dread. These are games people will remember for a very long time. But even with all of that, modern Nintendo games are always judged immediately. A good game isn't enough if it isn't as good as a game in the past. A solid entry feels disappointing if it isn't transformative, and when development cycles stretch longer and longer, every release has to justify years of waiting. That's an impossible standard for any company, especially one juggling years and years of legacy like Nintendo. I feel like this is where a lot of the Nintendo fell off narrative actually comes from. Not from declining quality, but from rising expectations. When Nintendo releases something merely good, it just feels worse than it used to. Not because the game is necessarily worse, but because it's competing with a memory that it can't beat. And when a game doesn't land, that's just amplified even more. At a certain point, you start to realize that a lot of the frustration surrounding modern Nintendo comes from wanting the company to recreate a feeling it never fully controlled in the first place. Nintendo didn't manufacture the magic of the Wii era or the early Switch years on purpose. Those moments happened because decisions, technology, timing, and player expectations accidentally aligned. Nintendo has been declared out of touch, irrelevant, greedy, doomed, and finished more times than most companies survive, and every time they eventually release something that changes the conversation. The uncomfortable reality is that Nintendo today is acting exactly like a company that knows knows how powerful it is, and it is frustrating, especially for fans who remember when Nintendo felt like the underdog. When buying a Nintendo console felt like opting into something niche and personal instead of something universally accepted, it can definitely change how people look at it. And yet, for someone picking up a Switch or Switch 2 for the first time, none of this baggage exists. They're just playing games, they're forming memories, and one day they'll be the ones saying Nintendo isn't what it used to be, and they'll be talking about the Switch 2 era. So was Nintendo actually better, quote unquote, back then? In some ways, yes. Prices were lower, they did have some more risk, the company felt smaller and more human. There are certain series that have just not come back that we would all like back. There's certain classics that haven't been matched, and some decisions Nintendo's making now are really bad decisions for the gaming industry. Game key cards, pricing games at $80 that should be nowhere near $80, selling slight remasters of Wii games for $70. These are all really bad for the industry, and definitely things we should be critical of. But even with that being said, if you go back to any other point in Nintendo's history that you remember fondly, you'll find similar issues arriving. Look at the end of the Wii U era, when sales were falling apart, Nintendo was releasing a lot of quality games, and people were saying the same thing that they are now. So Nintendo hasn't lost its identity. It's been repeating it for decades. The same cycle of innovation, stubbornness, backlash, success, and nostalgia keeps playing out, just with different hardware and higher numbers attached. And as long as Nintendo keeps surviving its own worst decisions, this conversation will never end, and it will repeat like a cycle. Personally, for me, I look back at the Wii and DS era very fondly. It's the generation I started Nintendo with. I wouldn't expect someone 20 years older than me to have the same feelings of that time, just like they shouldn't expect me to have the same feelings of their consoles. Who knows, maybe in 20 years we'll be looking back at the Switch 2 era and saying, Nintendo seemed to do everything right back then. Because let's say that Nintendo has a ton of great games this generation, and they end up doing a lot of great things. Do you think in 20, 25 years you're going to remember all the bad, or do you think you're going to remember more of the good and all the pleasant memories you have of this generation? That's just something to think about. I've just been hearing this sentiment a lot about Nintendo being better back then, and I've been guilty of saying this myself, but I really wanted to look into it more and see if that's actually true, or if people are being dramatic, and I couldn't find an answer. All I could do is say that people have been saying this for a long time, and it's never gonna end. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe and like this, and consider joining my Discord if you want to talk more about Nintendo and video games. Thank you for watching Domainy, and I'll see you next time.